The winter of 1942 settled heavily over Europe, a season of steel-gray clouds and artillery echoes rolling endlessly across a continent already worn thin. From the English coast to the ruins of Rotterdam, the Allies faced a brutal truth that no briefing paper could soften. The Luftwaffe still owned the daylight sky. Their fighter wings, honed by years of combat in Spain, Poland, France, and Russia, moved with a confidence that bordered on instinct. To American airmen newly arrived in theater, the war they stepped into felt colder, faster, and far more lethal than the training reels back home had ever suggested. At the airfields scattered across southern England, the U.S. Army Air Forces attempted something unprecedented: deep daylight bombing into the heart of occupied Europe. It was a doctrine built on precision, discipline, and faith in tight formation flying. But reality wasted no time in exposing its flaws. B-17s and B-24s, tough as they were, could not outrun German interceptors. And once the early American escorts, the P-38’s and first-generation P-47’s, turned back for lack of fuel, the bombers were alone. Crews knew this in the most personal way. An empty bunk after a mission told the truth faster than any intelligence report. And across the channel, German pilots sharpened their craft with a ruthless economy. They dove out of the sun, struck from altitude with cold precision, and vanished into cloud cover before the Americans could blink. A young bombardier wrote in a letter home, "We fly into a knife fight carrying hammers, and theirs is the sharper blade." The Allies needed more than courage. They needed a weapon that did not yet exist. What America did have, inside a cluster of brick buildings in East Hartford, Connecticut, was a gamble. On the factory floors of the Pratt Whitney Aircraft Company, teams of engineers had been assembling a power plant so massive that even seasoned designers muttered it might be too much engine for any single-seat fighter. The designation was plain: R-2800 Double Wasp. But the thing itself was anything but plain. The Axis powers built fighters around finesse. Pratt & Whitney built one around force. 18 cylinders, 2 rows. A supercharger system that looked more like industrial plumbing than aircraft engineering. And at full throttle, a roar that shook the concrete. Yet by early 1942, the men building it had reason to worry. Reports from Europe were grim. Allied fighters suffocating above 20,000 feet. Engines stalling in the thin air. Oil turning to sludge in the winter cold. German interceptors struck from heights the Allies couldn't reach. Every returning mission seemed to bring more questions, and fewer planes. 400 miles south, in Farmingdale, New York, another group studied the same reports with a mix of urgency and disbelief. At Republic Aviation, chief designer Alexander Kartveli had been tasked with turning the R-2800 into the heart of a new fighter. The assignment sounded simple on paper: build a machine that could climb higher, hit harder, and fly farther than anything Germany could put in the air. In practice, it bordered on impossible. The new fighter needed altitude, it needed endurance, it needed firepower, and above all, it needed to survive. Kartveli looked at the Double Wasp and didn't see a guarantee. He saw a chance. That was enough. Early sketches of the airframe drew muffled laughter from test pilots and quiet groans from mechanics. The design was enormous, broad-shouldered, almost brutish, its nose dominated by the massive Radial engine. It looked, one pilot joked, like a flying locomotive that misplaced the rest of its train. But Kartveli stayed the course. He believed that raw power and sheer strength, qualities others dismissed as crude, might be exactly what the air war demanded. War, however, was not impressed by theory. By summer 1942, Allied bomber losses climbed sharply. Gun camera footage showed German fighters slicing into formations as if carving through cloth. Letters home shifted in tone. Fear gave way to something quieter, heavier: resignation. A young captain summed it up in one sentence: "We do our job, we watch the sky, but it feels like they're fighting in their element, and we're visiting from far away." Against this backdrop, the first P-47 prototypes still struggled stateside. Test flights revealed quirks and dangers: unpredictable compressibility in steep dives, engine temperatures spiking without warning, landing gear that groaned under the aircraft's sheer weight. But every obstacle was met with an equal measure of American stubbornness. Engineers tuned, redesigned, reinforced. And through it all, the R-2800 kept thundering, refusing to yield. By autumn, crate-stenciled P-47C began crossing the Atlantic aboard Liberty ships. When the first Thunderbolts rolled onto muddy English hardstands under low gray skies, reactions were mixed. The fighter looked absurdly large, like something that should have arrived with its own mechanic and a forklift. But a veteran pilot traced a hand over the armor plate behind the cockpit and murmured, "Maybe this one gets us home." War would settle the question soon enough. And in the skies over Europe, where fire and speed ruled every second, the truth of the Thunderbolt, its weight, its engine, its purpose, would be measured in the only currency the air war respected: survival. The first operational P-47s reached the 4th Fighter Group in the spring of 1943, their silver skins gleaming under the pale English sun like newly minted armor. Pilots who had cut their teeth on nimble Spitfires studied the bulky arrivals with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Parked beside the sleek British fighters, the Thunderbolt looked almost defiant, broader, heavier, and perched high on oversized landing gear. One lieutenant shook his head and muttered, "It's built for a different kind of war." On paper, he wasn't wrong. The P-47 outweighed many fighters by nearly 2 tons. Its cockpit sat high above the long fuselage, and the giant R-2800 engine dominated the nose like a clenched steel fist. Mechanics groaned at the labyrinth of turbo supercharger, ducting running through the belly. Even the landing gear looked like something borrowed from a medium bomber, bracing for forces no one fully understood yet. But beneath all the doubts lay an invisible advantage, one only the sky could reveal. The first test flights out of Debden gave hints of something unexpected. Pilots discovered that once the Thunderbolt fought its way up to altitude, the R-2800 came alive. Above 25,000 feet, where other engines gasped for breath, the double Wasp surged with steady, unyielding power. One squadron leader climbed through a break in the clouds and felt the aircraft suddenly settle into a smooth, unstoppable rhythm. "She keeps breathing when the others start to wheeze," he said afterward, almost in disbelief. Still, that didn't answer the most important question. Could the Thunderbolt fight? A series of mock engagements against RAF Spitfires offered the first clues. The P-47 couldn't match the Spitfire's elegant turns. Few aircraft on Earth could. But it revealed a different, almost unsettling talent. When the Thunderbolt pointed its nose down, gravity became an ally. The aircraft accelerated so violently that the Spitfires struggled to keep pace without risking structural damage. In the debrief, a British pilot shrugged and said, "If it dives, nothing bloody follows." It was more than a quirk of weight. It was the beginning of a doctrine. Meanwhile, maintenance crews uncovered the Thunderbolt's other secret: resilience. The R-2800, built with deep cooling fins and a stubborn radial architecture, shrugged off battlefield stress in a way liquid-cooled engines simply couldn't. A hit that would kill a Merlin or Daimler-Benz often left the R-2800 leaking oil, angry, wounded, but alive. A crew chief wrote in his logbook, "These double Wasps, they don't scare easy." Small engagements soon proved him right. Early that summer, a flight of P-47s escorting bombers toward Rouen met a swarm of German fighters diving out of the sun. One young American, barely 20, suddenly found a Messerschmitt locking onto his tail. Instinct said, "Turn." The Thunderbolt said no. So he did the one thing the aircraft wanted. He rolled hard, shoved the nose down, and dove. The altimeter spun like a stopwatch. Wind shrieked past the canopy. The heavy fighter plunged like a stone dropped from heaven. When he finally pulled out over the channel, his hands shaking, the Messerschmitt was gone. Later that evening in the mess hall, he tried to put the moment into words. "It felt like the engine wanted to tear the air in half," he whispered. The room fell silent. The real turning point came almost by accident. During a joint exercise with returning bomber crews, the Thunderbolts were positioned above the bomber stream to simulate interceptions. What happened next surprised everyone. The P-47s didn't just dive fast, they dove repeatedly, hard, violently, over and over again. The weight of the airframe, the power of the double Wasp, the rugged wings, all of it combined into a style of attack no manual had ever described. A bombardier watching from a B-17 turret later said it looked like anvils dropping out of the sun, and then somehow climbing back for another hit. Word spread through the 8th Air Force like a rumor too wild not to be true. Pilots talked about the armor plate behind the cockpit, the thick wings that refused to bend, the engines that came home peppered with shrapnel, yet still thundering. One Thunderbolt returned with an entire cylinder blown open, the engine coughing, smoking, but still turning. These stories, half technical, half myth, began shaping something more powerful than doctrine, belief. When new pilots arrived, the veterans greeted them with the same quiet mantra. She's a diver. Use the weight. Trust the engine. And confidence in war is its own kind of fuel. By late 1943, the P-47 was no longer a curiosity. It was a presence, a machine with a reputation built on resilience, not grace. Yet its true identity, the role it had been unconsciously built for, had not yet fully emerged. That revelation waited across the Channel, in the convoys, rail yards, and armored columns of occupied France. There, in the churn of smoke and steel, the Thunderbolt would unveil a weapon no one had expected. Not speed, not altitude, but the terrifying, crushing certainty of a dive so fast and so punishing that even the enemy on the ground would have a name for it. The secret forged in Pratt Whitney's workshops was about to show its full power. And when it did, the war on the ground, and in the sky, would never look the same. By the spring of 1944, the war in Western Europe had shifted into a new and unrelenting phase. The Allies were preparing for the Great Invasion, and every rail line, every convoy route, every hidden battery in France had to be broken apart before the first landing craft touched sand. For the men of the 8th and 9th Air Forces, this meant a new kind of mission, a low, brutal, intimate war fought just above treetops. And for the P-47 Thunderbolt, it meant stepping into the role destiny had been carving for it since the day the first R-2800 engine roared to life. Not through doctrine, not through planning, but through necessity. On a raw April morning, clouds rolled over the Channel like a gray tide refusing to lift. At a forward airfield hacked out of English farmland, Thunderbolt crews moved through pre-flight preparations with the quiet rhythm of men who had done this too often to speak about it. Weapons teams hauled 500-pound bombs beneath the wings, dull shapes of steel and intent. Armorers snapped long belts of 50-caliber rounds into place, each one disappearing into a gun bay with a mechanical finality that made the ground tremble. The briefings had changed, no longer about air superiority. Now it was bridges, rail yards, armor columns, lines of retreat. A squadron commander summed it up with a slow exhale, dark circles beneath his eyes. We're going to break the German spine before our boys hit the beaches. The Thunderbolts lifted into the haze, heavy with fuel, ammunition, and something harder to name. The world below blurred into watercolor greens and browns, fields, villages, winding streams. But war waited beyond the coast. As the formation crossed into France, flak blossomed in the distance like black, angry flowers. The attack run was seconds away. What happened next would enter Thunderbolt legend. When the formation rolled over into their dives, it wasn't the clean, shallow angle of a fighter making a quick strike. These were plunges, steep, punishing arcs where gravity grabbed the aircraft by the shoulders and dragged it toward the earth. The airframe trembled, the altimeters spun. The sky became a tunnel of wind and violence. Several pilots swore later that it felt less like flying and more like committing to something, an act of will as much as skill. This was where the R-2800 revealed its true character. Most engines lost power in a steep dive. Compression would spike, superchargers would choke, metal would protest. But the double Wasp didn't falter. The labyrinth of ducts and turbines feeding it seemed to inhale the dive, pushing fresh, cold air into the cylinders with increasing fury. The propeller bit into the wind as if carving a path downward. A pilot from the 362nd Fighter Group wrote in his diary, "I eased the nose down and she went past 400, then 450. It felt like riding the front edge of a thunderstorm." German gunners, used to the predictable angles of Stukas and Typhoons, struggled to track the hurtling silver shapes. Some didn't even fire. By the time they swung their guns, the P-47s were already roaring past in a blur of metal and noise. At the bottom of the dive, the world erupted. Bombs fell in disciplined intervals, tumbling end over end before slamming into the rail yard. Explosions tore locomotives from their rails. Boxcars burst apart, sending wheels and splinters into the air. tracks twisted like molten ribbon. Then came the strafing passes. 8 caliber guns firing together created a sound that infantrymen on both sides would never forget. A rolling, mechanical thunder that seemed to claw at the earth itself. Tracer rounds stitched red arcs across the battlefield. Trucks vanished in fireballs. Ammunition dumps erupted like miniature suns. German troops dove for cover, many abandoning vehicles outright. One Luftwaffe pilot later admitted, "When the jugs came down, they fell like anger from the sky. No machine we flew could follow them. When the Thunderbolts pulled away, smoke trailed from several. One aircraft had lost half a section of wing surface. Another leaked oil in a dark, steady stream. A third had taken a direct flak hit beneath the engine cowling. But the engines kept turning, always turning. Back at the debriefing tent, reconnaissance photos were spread across a wooden table. Rail lines severed, engines overturned, convoys shattered. The room fell into a silence thick enough to press against the walls. Not reverence, not shock. Recognition. The Thunderbolt had not just survived the dive. It had owned it. Word spread quickly. Rumor became testimony. Testimony became doctrine. Thunderbolt pilots learned to climb high above the target, forming a loose halo before peeling off one at a time in controlled fury. Ground units began calling the attacks Thunder Runs. German armored crews whispered about American fighters that dove like falling fortresses and survived hits that should have torn them apart. By June, the P-47 was the spearhead of the ground attack campaign. It hunted locomotives slicing through French valleys. It smashed German armor columns rolling toward Normandy. It shattered coastal defenses in the dim hours before D-Day. And everywhere it flew, it carried the same truth. Strength over elegance, endurance over grace, a dive like a hammer striking the anvil of Europe. The P-47 was no longer merely a fighter. It had become the most feared dive bomber in the European theater. But its true legacy wouldn't be written in the heat of battle. It would be written in the quiet after, when pilots climbed down from battered cockpits, laid a hand upon warm metal, and understood what had carried them home. Not luck, not fate, but a machine forged for moments just like this. By the winter of 1945, the war in Europe was staggering toward its end. The once unyielding Reich was collapsing under the weight of Allied armies, pushing from both east and west. Yet, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and along the river valleys leading toward the Rhine, pockets of German resistance still fought with a ferocity born of desperation. For the men of the 9th Air Force, the pilots, crew chiefs, and armorers who had watched the Thunderbolt evolve from oddity to lifeline, the final months of the war carried a mixture of exhaustion, grim resolve, and a quiet gratitude for the machine that had carried them through the fire. At forward airfields carved from the mud of liberated France, rows of P-47s sat streaked with oil, soot, and the scars of a year spent diving into hell. Their once bright nose art was chipped by gravel, their gun ports blackened by cordite, their fuselages stitched with flak holes large and small. But beneath that battered skin, the R-2800 engines remained stubbornly alive. Mechanics worked through frostbitten mornings, tapping frozen tools against steel cowling, coaxing warmth into cylinders that had endured more punishment than any engineer in East Hartford had ever intended. One crew chief, a veteran from Debden, one of the first men to put a wrench to a Thunderbolt, carried a small, sweat-stained notebook in his jacket. In it were 2 lists: the engines his squadron had lost, and the far longer list of engines that had brought their pilots home despite shrapnel, fire, or sheer mechanical outrage. One icy evening, he closed the notebook and told a young replacement pilot, "They're stubborn things. They don't give up unless you do." He wasn't talking only about the engines. The war was slowing, but it had not gentled. German columns retreating toward the Rhine were defended by anti-aircraft guns hidden in barns, behind stone walls, under piles of brush. Thunderbolt pilots flying low-altitude missions faced a kind of danger foreign to the clean duels of high-altitude escort work. Down low, the enemy wasn't a flash of wings in the sun. It was a muzzle buried in a hedgerow, a gunner behind a church wall, a flak trap waiting at the bend of a frozen road. On a frigid February afternoon, a flight from the 365th Fighter Group, the Hell Hawks, dove on a convoy outside Bonn. Snow dusted the fields like chalk. Smoke from burning houses drifted in shredded curtains across the road. The P-47s descended in pairs, their engines echoing off the valley walls with the unmistakable thunder of the double Wasp pushed to its limits. The first pass shattered several vehicles and scattered infantry across the icy ground, but the flak gunners were ready for the second pass. A black puff burst beneath the wing root of one Thunderbolt, the explosion rocking the aircraft so violently it seemed to twist in the air. Shrapnel tore through the lower fuselage. For a moment, the pilot felt only silence and the sickening weight of gravity. Then, the vibration, the heartbeat. The R-2800 was still turning. Wounded but alive, he fought the controls, coaxing the battered aircraft up and away from the battlefield. Hours later, in the fading light, ground crews counted more than 80 holes in the airframe. The engine cowling was charred black. Oil leaked in dark streaks across the fuselage, but the cylinders had held. When the pilot climbed down trembling, he rested a hand on the warm, scarred metal and whispered, "Not today." Stories like this didn't become headlines. They didn't appear in after-action reports. They passed quietly from squadron to squadron, carried on cigarette breaks and late-night conversations. No speeches, no grand pronouncements, just the simple growing recognition that the Thunderbolt's legacy wasn't measured in the enemy it destroyed, but in the Americans it saved. Peace, when it finally came, arrived not with fireworks, but with a long collective exhale. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered, Thunderbolt groups gathered for final debriefings that felt more like farewells. Pilots turned in their charts, their flak vests, their sidearms. Mechanics cleaned tools that had never known a peacetime workshop. Engines that had roared over Normandy, Saint Sea. Low and the Ardennes sat silent under gray skies, their propellers aligned neatly, as if preparing for a final inspection. Some P-47s would return to the States. Some would remain in Europe as trainers. Many more would be melted down, turned into farm tools, bicycle frames, the metal bones of a rebuilding world. The men understood. Machines were built to serve. Memories were built to stay. In the years that followed, as veterans returned to towns and farms across America, the Thunderbolt resurfaced in quiet moments. A former pilot might mention the way the Jug rolled into a dive like a stone falling through water. A bombardier would smile at the memory of 850 calibers hammering the earth with a sound like rolling thunder. A mechanic, with the gentle pride of a craftsman, would talk about engines that should have quit, but didn't. For many, the P-47 represented more than a fighter. It was endurance made tangible. It was an industrial gamble that paid its debt in American lives saved. It was proof that innovation is sometimes nothing more than the refusal to accept limits others believe unbreakable. Decades later, at air shows across the United States, the surviving Thunderbolts still draw crowds. Children stare up at the broad, muscular wings. Veterans place a hand on the cold metal, remembering the warmth of an engine after landing. The slow, rhythmic ticking of a double Wasp cooling down after surviving another day. And when one of these restored aircraft lifts off, climbing into a blue summer sky, the sound carries something familiar. The steady, thunderous cadence of power, forged in a moment of history when courage, steel, and sheer stubborn will were all that stood between survival and oblivion. In that echo, history lingers, not as myth, but as memory, living in the roar of a machine that once fell from the heavens like a hammer, and rose again as one of the war's most unlikely heroes.